Today on Paul's Old Crap, we're going to take a look at the Cisco 7200 series chassis router, specifically the 7204 VXR model, which I own. The VXR series offers a backplane improvement over the original 7200 models and allows for faster network processor engines, as I believe the non-VXR models are limited to about 225,000 packets per second. The chassis was available in either 4-module or 6-module sizes as indicated by the specific model number 7204 or 7206. Full end of life and end of support for all members of the 7200 family appears to have been reached in around 2017, though these routers were around for a very long time before that point. I believe the original 7200 models were released in 1996, with the VXR series arriving in around 2002. I first got to see these in action at my job in 2005 as we used a pair of VXR routers for our border. The original processing engine model numbers would line up with the packets per second ability of the module, so the NPE 225 advertised 225,000 packets per second, and the NPE 400 advertised 400,000 packets per second. This changes with the NSE-1 module, which advertised 300,000 packets per second, though this processor module has a more specific use than the NPE models. The upgrade path for the NPE 400 is the NPE G1, which advertises 1 million packets per second and allows a RAM configuration of up to 1 gigabyte. The last processor engine released for the VXR is the NPE G2, which advertises 2 million packets per second. Several types of interface modules were released for the 7200 series, including multi-channel T1, T3, ISDN, token ring, synchronous serial including ISDN and others, ATM, SONET, and of course Ethernet configurations generally being 100 megabit or gigabit. Now let's take a look at my 7204 VXR and some of the modules I've obtained for my lab. So what we've got here is the 7204 VXR model. I've purchased this on eBay a number of years ago. I was basically looking for a router for my Cisco lab, preferably one that supported all of these different types of modules. So I got this for pretty cheap on eBay because nobody really wants these things. They're not the most powerful routers, obviously, these days. So yeah, and I'm assuming you can probably find a lot more of these because they are all end of life and end of support. So yeah, nobody wants to run them in production. But yeah, as you can see, this one does have 4 modules here, and then the blank spot down here is where you'd find the I/O module. Now, this router does not have an I/O module, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But basically the way these modules here work is you snap this to unlock, and then you just pull the module out, and you can put basically anything you want in here. Now, the types of modules that are available, sometimes you will have modules that won't work on the older network processing engines. So for example, the Gigabit Ethernet card does not work on, I believe, the NPE 300 or below. I did have a problem when I was trying to use one of those. It required the NPE 400 or the higher modules than that. So, but yeah, before we get into the modules, we'll take a look at the back of the router. Now at the rear of the router is where you actually have your network engine. So what we've got down here, network processing engine. I don't know how well that's going to show up here, but this is the NPE G1, and this is, I believe, the second best available module for this series of router. The G2 is more powerful than this one, but for lab purposes, I didn't really think I would need anything like that. But in terms of power supplies, we do have, let's see here, there we go. It's a dual power supply system, and they are removable. I don't know if these are hot swappable. I wouldn't make that assumption, so probably don't remove them when the unit's on, unless the manual does say so. In this lab router, I don't have a second power supply installed. Wasn't a big deal for me. So what I've done here is I've removed the NPE G1 from the router, and we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between this and the other types of processor engines you might come across. Not too long ago, I did mention that this router does not have anything in the I/O module slot, and that's because the NPE G1 actually has what you would have found on the I/O module. So for example, the compact flash boot media here for your iOS image. We do also have the console port and then also an auxiliary port. Now, this also does include some Gigabit Ethernet ports, which you wouldn't find any of these on the older modules for the network processing engine, but that is a feature of the G1. Now, because the G1 does have these things, if you were to leave the I/O module that your router originally would have shipped with inside the slot, I don't know exactly what would happen. I think it might not boot properly. It was so long ago that I did this upgrade to my own router. I'm not too sure if it actually did cause a problem, because the I/O module would have conflicting boot media. So I don't know if the router would know exactly what to do about it. On the board itself for the NPE G1, there really isn't a whole lot of user serviceable components. We do have our, I believe these are the memory slots right in here, as the memory in this is adjustable. I believe it goes up to 1 GB of memory. And for this one, if I'm not mistaken, I believe I have about 512 megabytes installed. And I have no intention of ever changing that. I believe that was more than enough for my needs. The only other thing in here would be a battery. I suppose if the battery on yours is dead, you can just swap it out with a new one there. Probably just a standard battery you could find in any electronic shop or whatever. So jumping back around to the front of the unit, when I talked about the I/O module that would have been in this slot here, this is what the I/O module looks like. Now, in this particular one, I did actually already remove the smart media card, but that would have just been this here. I believe this, oh no, maybe not smart media, it's just a standard flash PC MCIA type card. This is where it would have stored the boot files for the iOS. So because the NPE G1 does have compact flash on the back, this entire I/O module it's basically not used, because as you can also see, we do have, over here we have a console port, next to that we have the auxiliary port. So these are the same ports that you found on the back of the NPE G1. And this I/O module also includes 2 fast Ethernet ports. Now, also on the back of the NPE G1 we had Gigabit Ethernet. So, I mean, this would just be extra Ethernet ports, not really a big deal. But having this inserted into the router might actually cause a problem. I don't really remember if it works or not. I think I originally pulled this module out of my router because of the conflict, and it just wouldn't boot off of the compact flash. So, yeah. But what I do also have here, this is actually, I think it's an older version of the input-output controller. So it does have the same slots for the flash card there. The Ethernet, this is a strange looking port. It just says FE and then MII. So FE for fast Ethernet, I would assume, but it's this strange looking port there. I'm not too sure what that would be. But it does also have the RJ45 there. And this one, its console and auxiliary ports are the real old types of, like, these old serial type connections. So the standard Cisco console cable would not work on this. You'd have to get one of those RJ45 to whatever this is adapters. So I'm assuming this I/O module probably shipped on some of the very early 7200 series routers. So, like, I'm talking like the mid to late 90s versions. So, yeah. And then it's got a SIM here. I have no idea what that would be for. Yeah. So yeah, and unfortunately I don't have the plate that would have been in here for any of these routers that already had the NPE G1 and didn't use the I/O module. So unfortunately I just have this spot open collecting dust on my shelf. So going back to when we were talking about the network processing engines, what I've got here is the NPE 300 and the NPE 400. Now, as you can see, there's absolutely no ports whatsoever on these modules. So if you were using one of these in your VXR router, you would definitely need to have the I/O module down in here. Otherwise, you'd have no console and you'd have no booting. Now, this one, it's a very large board, and we've also got RAM slots in here. This is what my router originally came with on eBay. And I can't remember exactly how much memory was on this thing, but the NPE 300, it does allow for all of the modules that I previously used to work, with the exception of the Gigabit Ethernet. It just wasn't able to support that kind of bandwidth on the backplane or whatever, so yeah, it's a fairly old module, but the upgrade to that is the NPE 400. This is much smaller. The board is like less than half the size, maybe. And this also, the processor that this uses is actually the MIPS RM7000. Now, the NPE 400 and the NPE 300, I believe both use the same RM7000 processor, this one just being faster. And I believe this is the RAM module here. I'm not too sure what this was, maybe like 128 or 256 megabytes. Yeah, but yeah, this is basically nothing above the 400 until you jump into the NPE G1 series. So, like I said before, if you were using either of these modules or any of the modules prior to this, so there was also the NPE 225, and I think there was the NPE 200. I'm assuming those ones were also the same deal. There'd be no ports on it, and you'd have to use the I module. Alright, let's jump into talking about the modules. As you can see here, I do have a collection of 6 modules, which exceeds the capacity of my router. Obviously, I can only use 4 of these at a time. The only way around that is if I was to go with the 7206 VXR, in which case I could fit all of these modules in there, but I don't really need to do that. Some of these modules are redundant because of the network engine that I'm using. So for example, when we're talking about the Gigabit Ethernet module, that's what this is. So this is basically just one single board, one single port. If you look at the board itself, it looks like this was potentially available with 2 of these ports, because there's just like an empty spot here on the PCB. So yeah, but yeah, this is like a fiber optic type port. If you pull this out, let's see, there we go. Pull this module out. If you wanted to go gigabit with copper, I believe you can get that type of module for this, but at the time, I think using fiber was probably more popular. So this, because the back of my NPE G1 does already have 3 Gigabit Ethernet interfaces, both copper, and if I wanted to have one of these modules in there, I could use the fiber as well. So because my NPE G1 does have that, there's really no point for me running this in my router. So yeah, this is one of the modules that I just don't bother using at all. The other module that, while it's interesting, I don't actually keep in my chassis. This one here, it just says HSSI, which I think is, I'm assuming it means high-speed serial interface. Now, I can be wrong about that, but it is some sort of weird type of serial plug that I have no idea. Outside of this module, I don't think I've ever seen this type of plug before. So, yeah, it's very strange. And yeah, I don't really have any further information about this. I don't believe these are overly popular. You could probably pick them up on eBay for like $5 because, you know, who knows what this does. So yeah, this is another one of the modules that I basically do not keep inside my router. So another module here, this is redundant in my case, but I still keep it in the router. This is a fast Ethernet module. So we've got 2 RJ45 Ethernet ports here, and this will give us up to 100 megabit speeds. I don't know. I figure you can't go wrong with having too many Ethernet ports. And also on this, we've also got these like empty spots here where I'm assuming this module would have been available with 4 Ethernet ports as well. Yeah, I just keep this in there for access to Ethernet on the front, because where I keep this in my lab, it's usually a pain to get to in the rear. Now we get to some of the interesting stuff. What I've got here is a multi-channel T1. Now, in these days, there's probably not a whole lot of uses for T1 modules, but I did want to build a very antique network in my house, so I have the T1 module, and I have even more Cisco routers that also have T1 modules in them, and I network them together. Now, when you look at the T1 module, it looks like standard Ethernet, but it is not. What I've also got here is the actual cable. This does actually look like an Ethernet cable. However, the leads inside there, they're not the same as an Ethernet cable. So on the other end of this cord, it is much different, and that's why this will not work as an Ethernet cord, and an Ethernet cord will not work as a T1 cable. So if you are running an old home network with some T1 modules like I am, you have to get the right cables for it. This here, this one is the enhanced ATM. Now, I think it took me a few tries to get this combination of module correct with some of my other routers. This is a DS3, and like it says right in here, DS3, and I was looking specifically for this so I could network with yet another one of my old routers. And I believe there's actually a few of these ATM type modules, and yeah, I wasn't getting any link on some of my earlier ones, so I was just basically buying the wrong module. But I know absolutely nothing about ATM, so yeah, I just wanted to have some neat networking going on. And if we take a look at the cable this uses, this is like, I guess this is a coaxial type cable. I don't really know much about it other than I had to buy it specifically for this module, so yeah, just basically goes in like that. So yeah, this is pretty neat, and I've used this to network one of my other older routers. The last module we have here, this is a serial module, and I don't really know much about these serial interfaces, but I thought this was pretty interesting because it had all 4 ports on here, and I wanted to find another one of these for one of my older routers, and I did. So on this fast serial interface, what I have is this strange cable that I bought, and this basically plugs into one port and then run it to wherever your router is. It's a strange interface, and I don't know what the length that you're allowed to use is on these cables, but I think I've got a 6-foot cable or so for that. And I'm not actually sure what type of speeds you get out of these things. I don't suspect it's a lot, but yeah, I don't know. It's just one of those odd types of networks that you don't see very often, and that's pretty much what drew me to this. So now that we've got all the modules reinstalled into the chassis, I think we'll boot it up and watch the boot sequence. All right, so I've powered on the router, and let's take a look at what we've got here. The system bootstrap, I think that's like the internal built-in software, so it's non-replaceable. I'm assuming that's right on the actual network engine module. Anyway, we're just waiting for the next stage after ROMmon to load, which is like, I think it's the kboot image, which is what it's loading right now before it actually reaches the iOS part. And I will note, while I was prepping for this video, I did actually put the I/O module back into the chassis, and I tried turning it on, and it actually halted right at this point here. And it just sat there, wouldn't go any further. So yeah, if you are running like the NPE G1 or G2, more than likely, it's not going to go anywhere with the I/O module. So yeah, but now we're just going to wait for whatever else it's complaining about to finish. And now it's loading the actual iOS image off of the compact flash card. And so it tells us here we're running the Advanced Enterprise K9, and it's version 15.2. This build isn't quite the latest that was ever released for this platform. I think it was 15.2 and then 4M11 maybe was the last version. Haven't checked the Cisco site in a while, but that tells us we've got a bunch of other stuff here. We've got our 700 megahertz CPU, and in the NPE G1, it's a Broadcom CPU, not a MIPS like the earlier network processors. And then some other information here. We got our 2 fast Ethernet, 3 gigabit, 4 serial, 1 ATM interface, and then our 4 channelized T1 interfaces. And it tells me that it's 128 megabyte ATA compact flash card that's in the router there. And it's loaded up into the default, let's see, terminate auto install, yes. I think at some point in the past, I erased the router's configuration for a project and forgot about that. I didn't realize it was completely wiped until I turned it on just now. But so yeah, basically all of the interfaces are admin down because we've essentially got no configuration at all. So if we enter enable mode, take a look at the version there, everything we expect to see. So we've got like the bootloader here is the 7200K boot image, 15.2, whatever. I think that was just whatever the latest was on the Cisco site at the time I downloaded it. And then the actual iOS that we already looked at there. And let's see. So the information here, Cisco 7204 VXR with the NPE G1. And like we looked at earlier, the processor speed tells us, of course, we have the 4 slots. And just a summary of what the interfaces we had were. So if we do just a quick look at the running configuration, let's find some information here. So when it comes up with the T1 controllers, there's no configuration, so it's all raw. If you're actually doing work on the T1s, you might change the, I think, like a mode between this standard controller mode and how I was using it before. But that would be a whole other video to cover all of that, I think, because that's pretty in-depth and I've forgotten most of the commands. But if we go down a little further, so we've got our standard Gigabit Ethernet, not much to see there. Then we do have our serial interfaces. Those were those weird looking plugs. There was 4 of them. So we got 0, 1, 2, 3. And we go down further. The fast Ethernet, yeah, nothing special there. And then the ATM interface, which was our DS3. So if we do a, I think I was going to look at show interface, ATM, and 3.0. So if we look at, let's see, bandwidth. So that's approximately 45 megabit, which sounds about right for a DS3 interface. And if we were to look at, let's see, show interface, the serial, and I think it was 1.0. So those weird serial interfaces, the bandwidth on those ones, 1544 kilobits a second, so a 1.544 megabit serial interface is what those weird plugs are. So about the same that you would expect from a T1. So yeah, that's interesting. I don't think there was much else we were going to take a look at, just basically seeing that the router does in fact boot up and gives you all of these neat interfaces. I think at some point in the future, what I probably will do is a more in-depth video on the configuration and different scenarios I do have an old tech blog that I keep running. It's available on the web. The address is www.omgwtfbbq.ca. And on there, I do have some Cisco articles where I've actually used this router in order to do some custom labs in my house, where I've connected this to other routers over like the T1 and different options like that. So if you're looking for some information on how to do that sort of configuration, I do have that up on that website. And at some point when I have more time, I probably will make videos on doing all that configuration. But yeah, if you're looking for neat old Cisco routing equipment, the 7200 VXR series are quite convenient for all the different types of interfaces that you can run. It's yeah, it's neat for old networking, and it is a hobby of mine. So yeah, I really do like this router, and I'm glad I bought it. And I can't think of anything else to talk about, so I think that will wrap up the video. Thank you for watching.